On the eve of his crucifixion, Jesus prays to his Father, I have given them your word, and the world hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them from the world, but you keep them from the evil one. Hey everyone, welcome back to Aliens on Earth, Season 2, Episode 15, in our series Discovering Jesus in the Old Testament. If you're new to the podcast, first of all, welcome, and I hope you'll be blessed by today's episode. I want to invite you to listen to our previous episodes in Season 2 and subscribe to the podcast. That way, you don't miss any of our new releases. But last week we explored the book of Esther, where God's name is never really mentioned, yet his fingerprints are everywhere in that book. We saw how Esther, a young queen, stood in the gap for her people, risking her life to intercede before the king. And this pointed us directly to Jesus, our greater advocate, who intercedes for us before the throne of heaven. And we see that in Hebrews 7:25. Now we turn from that royal courts of Persia and the rebuilt city of Jerusalem to the ashes of Uz. And this story is the story of Job, a man who teaches us that even when life collapses, God's purpose still stands. The book of Job wrestles with the question, why do the righteous suffer? We'll see beneath that question lies something way deeper, a revelation of Christ, the innocent sufferer who brings redemption through the pain. So hang tight, grab that coffee, and let's jump right in. Hey guys, real quick, before we jump in, if you've been blessed by this podcast or find it impactful, I'd like you to hit the follow button. Be a partaker of spreading God's truth by sharing this with your friends, coworkers, family, or even strangers. Let's spread the truth of Christ together. Now, back to this episode. So I want to start this off with this sort of preview or the pre-story, the behind the scenes of Job. And it's interesting because we see here God's confidence on display, his confidence in his servant Job. And he poses this really interesting, maybe even kind of obscure question. He says, this is Satan. He says, have you considered my servant? And Job 1:8. Let's read the verse. It says, and the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? But before Job ever faced any suffering at all, this conversation took place in heaven. And the interesting part about this is Job never heard this conversation happen. God wasn't angry with Job. He was actually boasting about him. He was bragging to Satan, saying, there's nobody on this earth like him. And he was proud of his servant's faith. Imagine that dialogue if you can for a second. God and Satan having a conversation like that. How much faith God had in Job, the fact that his heart was so devoted to him. And that divine dialogue, God essentially says, I trust him, he knows me, and he'll stand. He'll withstand whatever you throw at him. And think about that. Job had no idea that his name had been spoken in heaven. He didn't know that God was pointing him out to Satan. Like pretty much saying, yeah, dude, that's my man right there. Like all Job saw though was the other side of things. He saw the loss. He felt the pain. All he heard was silence from God. From Job's view, like everything seemed like it was falling apart. And let's look at God's view for a second. But from God's view, Job was being entrusted with a test. He was being entrusted with a test that would echo across eternity. We often see only the test part, not the trust behind it. Job didn't know that heaven was watching, cheering, and really trusting him to hold that line. And in our lives too, what looks like chaos might actually be God's confidence in us. He knows that our faith refined by fire will reveal his glory ultimately. Just something to look at here is sometimes our trials aren't proof that God's disappointed or that he's absent or that he doesn't really care. They can be proof that God is entrusting us with something bigger than what we can see. Now, this doesn't mean our own actions don't have consequences. So if you get caught speeding and get a massive fine, that's not God entrusting you with a divine testing. you just need to chill out, like follow the speed limit. But maybe you're in a season where you feel like Job, where you feel like losing things that once felt so secure. You can't see what God is doing behind the curtain, but what if right now God is saying about you, have you considered my servant? What if heaven's pointing to your faithfulness as proof of his faithfulness? I want to challenge you this week. When you're facing this hardship, pause for a second and pray. God, I don't see the full picture, but if you trust me with this test, I'll trust you with the outcome. And you're not being punished, you're being entrusted. Heaven knows your name. It may seem a little cheesy to us Western Christians to take a suffering as blessing or wear it as a badge of honor. We're so conditioned to use Jesus as a means to an end. Usually that brings about wealth or comfort here on earth. But we miss out on that true beauty of intimate relationship with him. So much so that he knows that even if we're tested, we'll withstand, we'll endure, which leads us to this everlasting blessing, far beyond what we could get here. And as we move along, we see Job's integrity play out in this loss. There was one devastating day where Job loses his wealth, his servants, and all 10 of his children. Then his health begins to fail. And we find him sitting in ashes, scraping his sores with these sort of pottery break shards of whatever's left. Yet Job says this profound statement in Job 1 verse 20 through 21. He says, "Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" Job wept and he worshiped. He didn't fake strength. He didn't fake some macho, everything's good, all is well, praise the Lord feeling. He wept and worshiped. He expressed faith. This mirrors Jesus in Philippians 2, 6 through 8. We quote this verse a lot on this season. And it says, "Though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Both Job and Jesus show us that obedience is proven not just by how we praise in blessings, but how we worship in suffering. True worship isn't really measured by what you gain, but by what you refuse to lose, your trust in God. So another challenge would be find one area where you've been grieving or complaining and speak faith over it instead. Say it out loud. Say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Worship God where it hurts. That's where heaven meets us, right there in that place. And it's interesting because even after all this, after all what he's saying, God doesn't just respond back to Job right away and go, "Man, that really touched my heart. Naked you came, naked you'll go. All right, it's time." Even after all this, heaven goes quiet. Job prays, he pleads, he questions, but there's no immediate answer. In Job 23, 8 through 10, he says, "Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I do not perceive him. And on the left hand, when he's working, I don't behold him. He turns to the right hand, but I do not see him." And then he says this, he says, "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tried me, I shall come out as gold." So Job is expressing that he doesn't feel God, but he trusts that God feels him. He believes that God knows his path, even if he can't trace his steps. So fast forward centuries later, Jesus experienced that same silence on the cross. Matthew 27:46 says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that cry, Jesus steps into Job's anguish, and ours really, and he endures this divine silence. So we would never be separated from God again. So God's silence doesn't mean his absence. Sometimes that quiet season, or those many quiet seasons, are where trust grows the strongest. And even in all that, if heaven feels silent, don't stop talking to God. Write this verse down if it helps you, and keep it visible. Write this very specific part. He knows the way that I take. Let it remind you, unseen doesn't mean unknown. And really, as we move forward, we see The mediator Job longed for something. He longed, if only there were one between us. We see this in Job 9:33. There's no mediator between us. Who might lay his hand on us both? Job felt distance between heaven's holiness and his pain. He longed for a bridge, someone who could stand in the gap, someone who could just be in the middle and bring God and man together. And centuries later, we see in 1 Timothy 2:5 that is answered. For there is one God and there is one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. Jesus is everything Job hoped for. He lays one hand on God and one on us, reconciling both in love and justice. So you don't need to struggle your way into God's favor. Jesus already opened the way. So whenever you pray this week, begin by saying, Jesus, thank you for standing in the gap for me. Pray with confidence, knowing that heaven hears you through your mediator. It's amazing because as we move forward, there's this declaration of resurrection that Job makes. He says, my Redeemer lives. In the middle of his suffering, Job's faith explodes with this sort of eternal hope. In Job chapter 19 from verse 5 through 27, it says, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand up upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. This is another very clear Old Testament prophecy of Christ's resurrection. Hope looked forward to a Redeemer who would stand upon the earth. And we look back and we see Jesus, who did. In John chapter 11, 25 through 26, he states this. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And that's exactly it. Faith that declares my Redeemer lives before the tomb is open. That's faith that moves mountains. So another challenge each morning this week, speak these words aloud. My Redeemer lives and he's working in my story. Let that turn your fear into faith and that despair into hope. And really, that leads us into the next point, that Job eventually sees his restoration and he ends up twice as good as he was before. And in the final chapter, Job's story turns not when he gets answers, but when he forgives. Job chapter 42 verse 10, and the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as many as he had before. Job's healing came not out of this sort of demand for justice, but from releasing the bitterness. When he prayed for those same friends, those that were around him that misjudged him, heaven moved on his behalf. And this mirrors Jesus again, who prayed on the cross. In Luke chapter 23 verse 34, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's an amazing point that restoration often begins when we let go of that resentment. And think of anyone who's hurt you. Pray for them sincerely. Maybe your breakthrough might be waiting on the other side of that forgiveness. And I want to close with these thoughts. Job's story isn't just about surviving pain. It's about being entrusted with it. God's confidence in Job wasn't misplaced, and neither is his confidence in you. Like Job, you might not see what's happening behind the scenes, but know this: God's boasting about your faith, even when you're weeping through the test. In 2 Corinthians 4:17, for this light and momentary affliction is prepared for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. When the ashes settle, you'll see it was never just some trial. It was an invitation to know God in a more deep way, so that when life hurts, don't ask why me. Ask, Lord, what glory are you preparing through me? Because even in the suffering, your Redeemer lives, and he's not finished writing your story. So next, as we move along in our series, we'll be diving into the book of Psalms, where the heart of worship and the heart of Christ has a similar tone. It beats as one, but until then, stay rooted in the word. And remember, even when you can't see the reason, you can trust the Redeemer. This is Aliens on Earth, and I'm your host, Nate Gazal. Peace.